it's been very heartening altogether, this upsurge of interest in agroforestry. Clearly, from a personal point of view, I would like to think, or hope to think, that we've had some small impact there. And I should say in that respect that I'm always impressed with the way in which people are affected if they come and visit the place and see what's happening in reality, rather than looking at papers or books or whatever, lectures. I think it's extremely important. I think it's vital worldwide, not just in this country, for the future because of the problems of climate change. In 1984, at a senior staff meeting at the Plant Breeding Institute, covering all sorts of different topics. I mean, these were monthly meetings. I think we used to have departmental meetings. In this particular one, the crop physiologist, Roger Austin, mentioned a word that I hadn't heard before. It was the first time I'd heard this word, and it was agroforestry. And I suddenly saw immediately what that meant, integrating agriculture and forestry in effect. And that was it. That was the key moment, because suddenly the idea of bringing together the diversity of the annual crops with effectively perennial crops, bringing them together to interact together, must make sense. And so, I read a bit about it, and very slowly, initially, got a feeling for what this was about. But it wasn't then until, nearly 10 years later, I suppose, nearly 10 years later, my wife and I were living in Switzerland at that time. I was working at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology as a professor of plant pathology. And Anne and I were talking about what we're going to do in the future. Were we going to stay in Switzerland? Was I going to retire? Were we going to stay there or go back to the UK? So we made the decision quite early on, really, that we were going to come back here. Having made that decision, we then were really thinking about, well, if we do, what are we going to do here? And I began to then get the idea, well, perhaps there's an opportunity to buy some land somewhere in the country and try and put into practice all these sorts of diversity approaches that I've been talking about, experimenting on, lecturing about, and so on. Would it work in a whole farm context? So that really brought us down to the idea of buying some land in order to see if we could lay out an agroforestry system, or indeed initially compare different agroforestry systems in practice. And so we decided to plump for Suffolk as an area which is extremely easy to work in agriculturally compared with many others. And there were quite a number of small properties available on the market. So we lined up a whole range Toby, our younger son, and I went off to watch a test match at Headingley and left Anne to decide how to put these properties in an order of preference. And we came back and looked at them in Anne's order of preference, and she was spot on, even though she's not a farmer or agriculturalist, or wasn't. And this was, Wakelyns was top of the list. Initially, it was a case of planning, as I say, different systems to compare. And we actually got as far as doing the initial planting in 1994, where we were still living in Switzerland. And that was through help from a guy called Neil Hutton at Shuttleworth College, which now no longer exists, sadly, in Bedfordshire. And he was one of the few people in the country actually teaching agroforestry. So he thought it was a great opportunity to be able to bring a couple of busloads of students with spades and so on to come and help us plant the whole thing. And we'd planned it out in considerable detail so that they could come actually on 2 days and virtually plant everything, which was great. Very exciting couple of days. And that was the start. We came back here full time in '97, so we could really get on with the job. And the trees grew, and they grew, and they grew. And with the Coppens systems, we were able to put in a wood chip boiler, so that now, or for the last 9 years or so, all of the central heating and hot water has come from the wood chip from the principally the hazel and willow coppice, which has been very nice, beautiful places to have with the alley cropping systems, and they're very effective and efficient, and takes a bit more management, but we get the advantages of cropping from the tree element and from what happens in the alleys between the trees. What I've gradually realised over the years is that although I was intending initially to compare these different systems, what I've come to think is that actually you need them all to maximise the diversity, produce a wider diversity of products and so on. And the sense of understanding and feeling about what we can do continues to grow. On the crop side, what we're now doing, we're working with hodmedods in Halesworth, who to my mind have exactly the kind of right idea for trying to keep the food chain as short as possible, and as a company working both with the farmers who are producing the crops that they want, that hodmedons want to sell to the consumer. So they work with the whole food chain from farmer through to consumer. And that, I think, is very positive in all sorts of different ways, in terms of the quality of the produce, the happiness of people all along the food chain, and the health as well as the happiness of those people. So we're trying to help with doing field trials with new crops or new versions of old crops to support and supplement that process. At the same time, I'm very interested in the potential of these agroforestry systems for renewable energy production. And I'm working with a guy called Richard Edwards in Wales, and he's interested in the idea of a small scale, emphasis on the small, combined heat and power system to suit this kind of operation, so that by producing the chips we can not only produce heat for the central heating of hot water, but also electrical energy. And then that can be extremely useful on a highly diversified small farm to help with, all the various sorts of processing that needs to be done, as well as extracting the heat from the wood. But that also now, what I'm trying to think about and do is, in a kind of parallel way with the trees as with the crops. With the crops, what we've done is to try to decentralize food production, if you like, to have a short food chain all the way from the crop to the consumer, everybody working together on a small scale but highly diversified. And we can do the same with the tree end of the business. Trees can produce products to eat, fruit, nuts, leaves for livestock. But at the same time, the energy, in a sense we can think of the trees in three parts, if you like. One is the basic stem and root system, which is providing resilient sustainability, if you like. I mean, the roots go deeper than the annual crops, so we bring up nutrients from lower down in the soil profile. Those nutrients will eventually be made available not only to the crops through leaf fall and root death, but also it's very important in relation to biodiversity, all the way from microbes to the larger animals, unfortunately muntjac and so on, although I'm told they do make extremely good sausage rolls. Then the timber that's produced, which can go for the energy, etc. And then the latest thing that we're trying, which other people have claimed can be very successful, which is the very young parts of the tree, the leaves and the youngest little twigs and buds and so on, which can be actually chipped and processed to use as a soil conditioner and fertilizer. So there are our parts. There's the engine, there's the produce that we can consume either as timber or fruit or whatever. We have some very good apples and therefore apple juice, for instance, and the potential for helping to feed the other part of the farm in terms of the annual crops. And I think that's something that's well worth developing in terms of thinking of a whole system which then is shortening the energy chain as well as the food chain. Because in both the food chain and the energy chain, if you think about modern large-scale industrialized agriculture, you have terrible problems in losses due to transmission, whether it's moving food all around the country or whether it's moving energy. And the figures for energy loss on a grid network are just enormous. 60% I think is an official figure on the grid, 60% energy loss. So if we can produce all of that short chain interactive, integrated kind of food with very little loss or a good reduction, let's say, in the costs of moving stuff about, and at the same time do the same with the energy, surely that adds up to or integrates into a much better farming system for the future, for the long term. The big worry initially was in relation to weeds. When we planted the trees, we planted them into a wheat crop. So we'd made the plans and sort of lined everything up for the alleys, everything running north-south, etc. We planted them straight into wheat, which was followed by a clover ley. Now that was all fine initially, but then the lines where the trees are growing, we stopped cultivating, of course. And we're growing the crops just in the alleys between these. And that meant that there was a tendency for lots of weeds to appear in the tree lines. And for a little while I was thinking, oh dear, what have we done? What a mess, this is going to wreck the management forever, isn't it? Because I was doing things like using a compact tractor to mow the sort of strip under the trees, which is actually a very pleasant job to do as you sort of weave among the trees. But, having to do that regularly several times a season, every season, was a bit ridiculous, to say the least. What I hadn't really thought about enough was the normal succession of plants in an environment. And of course, most of the weeds that are troublesome are pioneer plants. So any disturbed ground they will occupy and colonize very quickly. But if that is left undisturbed, then they fade out. They're competed against by a whole range of other plants. And of course that's what happened. And now we have an understory to those trees which is of no consequence at all in terms of the kind of weed concerns at all. But is a positive consequence in relation to biodiversity, because there we've got a natural sort of woodland grass, mainly grass dominated understory, which isn't a problem for the crop next to it, but has become a natural habitat with its own biodiversity. So it really is a sort of inbuilt part of the agroforestry system. Although, of course, if one wants to be intensive about it, there are all sorts of crops that can be grown under the trees in the shade as well. An obvious one would be sort of rhubarb, or another one which would be interesting to try and develop would be mushrooms of various sorts. It was a worry at the beginning, but turns out to be something that we can really make use of. I've worried for quite a long time that we really have no livestock. We have had a small chicken enterprise trying to make use of the trees, but we haven't really had livestock here, and I think livestock could be an important part of these systems, both in terms of the way they would deliver more from the output end of the agroforestry farm, but also in terms of what they might deliver in terms of manure to the cropping system, as well as the grazing, the use of leaves off the trees, etc. All of which I think would be good for the livestock and for the farm budget, as well as its sustainability. But if, as we now seem to be moving to an era where we have to think much more carefully about the energy that's moved into livestock production compared with that which goes directly into crops as human food, then maybe it wasn't such a concern in the end after all. One thing that I would be much more careful about if I were to start this again is the measurements and lining up things and lining up where the trees are, because we've tended to have a running problem with some trees that grow out much more than others, and if they happen to be right on the edge of the tree line, they begin to interfere with the edge of the alley. So making sure there's enough room for everything to grow and not interfere with the alley dimensions and shape, because that really needs to be set rather precisely in relation to how many plough bouts you might fit in when it's time for ploughing or mowing or whatever. When we started doing it, things like laser measures and so on hadn't really become common. So it was, tape measures and sticks and bits of paper and so on. So it was quite tricky to get it reasonably straight anyway. It's much easier to do that sort of thing these days, cheaply. But yeah, do the planning right at the beginning, because you're going to have to live with it for, one hopes, a long time. And it's not only, all this production of healthy food, renewable energy, etc., but just having the trees there is good for the soul. I mean, the Japanese, they have this new system of forest bathing. The idea that just walking and enjoying woodland is actually good for human beings. How that works exactly is, I don't think we yet know enough. But if we evolved, under sort of savanna conditions with low-level woodland everywhere, if that's how we evolved, we're going to be enjoying more trees around. And I certainly do, without a doubt. Is the camera alright? Because her tail wagged hard against the table.
It's fine. It's fine.